Every other primate on Earth is covered in fur. Chimpanzees, gorillas, the ancestors we share a common line with, all of them, still, today, wrapped in hair from head to foot. Humans aren't. At some point, one branch of that family lost almost all of it, and kept losing it, until a mostly bare-skinned ape was standing on an open plain with nothing between its body and the weather. That's strange enough on its own. What makes it stranger is the timing. Humans didn't lose their fur and immediately invent something to replace it. There's a gap, a real one, measured in hundreds of thousands of years, where our ancestors were both hairless and unclothed at the same time. So the actual question isn't just why we started wearing clothes, it's how anyone survived long enough in between to get around to inventing them. The leading explanation for the fur loss itself comes down to heat. As early humans moved out of dense forest and into open, hot savanna, and started hunting in the middle of the day, thick body hair became a liability. It trapped heat instead of the cold. Losing it, combined with a huge increase in sweat glands, let the body cool itself far more efficiently during long, hot pursuits. Researchers placed this shift at roughly 1 to 2 million years ago, tied to that same shift toward life on the open plain. Here's the part that doesn't get said enough. That left a genuinely enormous window, over 1 million years by most estimates, where hominins were walking around essentially naked. No fur for insulation, and, as far as the fossil and genetic record shows, nothing yet invented to take its place. For most of that window, that was fine. They were still in warm parts of Africa. The problem only became urgent once humans started pushing into colder places, and figuring out exactly when clothing showed up to solve that problem turned out to require one of the strangest research methods in all of anthropology. Clothing doesn't survive. Cloth, hide, fur, all of it rots, burns, or gets eaten within a few centuries at most, so archaeologists have almost nothing to directly dig up and date. What they have instead is lice. Head lice have been with humans for millions of years, evolved specifically to grip hair. Body lice, the kind that live in the seams of clothing and only visit skin to feed, are a completely different, more recent branch, one that can only survive somewhere that didn't exist before clothing did. In 2011, a research team led by David Reed at the University of Florida sequenced the DNA of both louse types and calculated exactly when they split apart genetically. Because body lice couldn't have existed before there was clothing to live in, that split marks about as directly as biology can the point clothing itself first appeared. Their answer, roughly 170,000 years ago. Reed put it simply, body lice or clothing lice almost certainly didn't exist until clothing came about in humans. That date lines up strikingly well with something else in the human story. Humans started migrating out of Africa into much colder regions around 100,000 years ago. Clothing, on this timeline, wasn't a nice to have. It shows up roughly 70,000 years before humans needed it to survive somewhere cold, which is either a remarkable coincidence or exactly the kind of head start you'd expect if clothing is what made that migration possible at all. Genetics gave archaeologists a number. Then, a decade later, actual tools pushed that number even further back, and from a completely different continent. In 2021, researchers working at Contrebandiers Cave on the Atlantic coast of Morocco published a find of over 60 bone tools, plus one tool made from a whale or dolphin tooth, dated to between 120,000 and 90,000 years old. Alongside them, the bones of foxes, jackals, and wildcats, carrying cut marks in exactly the pattern you'd expect if an animal is being skinned for its pelt, not butchered for meat. Dr. Emily Hallett, who led the analysis, called the combination highly suggestive proxy evidence for the earliest clothing in the archaeological record. Neither piece of evidence, the lice or the bones, is a direct photograph of someone wearing a coat, but they land in almost the same window, closing in from two completely independent directions, DNA on one side, cut marks on animal bone on the other, and they agree. Somewhere between roughly 170,000 and 90,000 years ago, humans went from bare-skinned to actively processing fur into something wearable. Here's where it gets more interesting than a single invention date. Clothing wasn't invented once. Archaeologist Ian Gilligan, who has traced this in the most detail, describes it as having two separate origins, one biological, one cultural, separated by tens of thousands of years and a real jump in sophistication. The first stage was simple. Hide scrapers, tools for cleaning the underside of an animal's skin, show up with early hominins in northern China as far back as 800,000 years ago, and near what's now London around 400,000 years ago, both during warmer interglacial spells, both consistent with nothing more than a loose hide draped and tied over the shoulders. Functional, thermal, unglamorous. The second stage needed a completely different kind of tool, and it took far longer to arrive. Blade technology, capable of cutting hide into shaped pieces instead of just draping it whole, appears around 300,000 years ago. Bone awls, for punching holes to lace pieces of hide together, show up in southern Africa around 75,000 years ago, during a notably cold stretch. The real leap, the eyed needle, fine enough to pull a threaded sinew through two pieces of hide and sew them into a fitted shape, doesn't appear until around 30,000 to 22,000 years ago. That's the difference between throwing a hide over your shoulders and cutting, sewing, and tailoring it to your actual body. And it's exactly the difference that seems to have mattered most, at exactly the moment two different human species were both trying to survive the same brutally cold continent. Neanderthals lived through European winters for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans ever arrived there. They used fire, they used tools, and the archaeological and genetic record makes clear they weren't the dim-witted stereotype popular culture spent a century building. But when it comes to clothing specifically, the evidence points to something narrower than what modern humans were doing at the same time. Paleoanthropologist Mark Collard at Simon Fraser University compared the animal remains found at Neanderthal sites against sites used by early modern humans living in the same cold parts of Europe. Modern human sites were full of the bones of animals whose fur is genuinely excellent for cold weather clothing: rabbits, foxes, wolves, and, notably, wolverines. An animal whose fur famously resists frost buildup, still used today specifically to line the hoods of Arctic parkas. Neanderthal sites showed no wolverine remains at all, and a narrower range of species overall. Combined with modern humans' eyed needles and evidence of hide tanning, Collard's reading is that Neanderthals were most likely working with simple, cape-like coverings, while modern humans nearby had fitted, tailored, genuinely engineered cold-weather clothing, wolverine ruffs included. Collard is careful about the word cause. Evolution, he points out, is typically a lot of small differences leading to big differences longer term, not one dramatic single reason. But the timing is hard to ignore. Neanderthals disappear from the fossil record roughly 40,000 years ago, only a few thousand years after modern humans arrive in the same territory, carrying, quite literally, better coats. Not the whole explanation, but a real, physical, testable piece of one. Once clothing existed for warmth, it didn't stay only about warmth for long. At Sung here, near modern Moscow, burials dated to around 34,000 years ago were found covered in more than 13,000 carefully carved mammoth ivory beads, arranged in patterns that only make sense if they'd been sewn directly onto fitted garments, not simply scattered as loose decoration. That's not a coat someone grabbed to survive a cold morning. That's clothing as a display, a signal, a piece of someone's identity, buried with them because it mattered. Gilligan frames it as clothing having two separate jobs from the start: thermal necessity first, and then, once the technology existed, a second, entirely different use, purely cultural, unrelated to temperature at all. Every piece of clothing since has, in some proportion, been doing both jobs at once. The parka is still keeping someone warm exactly the way it did 170,000 years ago. The specific cut, color, and brand on it is doing something that has nothing to do with survival, and everything to do with what clothing became the moment it stopped being only about staying alive. There's something quietly strange about the fact that what you're wearing right now traces back through an unbroken line of the exact same problem: a hairless animal in a cold place, solved first with a dead animal's fur draped over the shoulders, then with a needle, then with a display of 13,000 beads that had nothing to do with staying warm at all. I'll admit, I never thought about my own coat as technology until I looked into this. It's a tool with a 170,000-year service record, older than agriculture, older than the wheel, older than almost anything else we still use every single day without a second thought. So, next time you put on a jacket, that's worth a second thought. What's the oldest piece of clothing you still hang on to, and why do you think you kept it? Tell me in the comments.